All right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me with this? No.
It's not on.
It should be on, but you know what? We're not going to mess it. I can just project. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight on this rainy, cold evening. I appreciate you all coming out. My name is Mariah Berlenga-Shevchuk. I'm the head of public engagement here at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. Welcome back if you've been before, and welcome if it's your first time here. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Daniel Duford, who is the curator of the fabulous exhibition downstairs, The Only Way to Hold a Weight, Serra Prints from the collections of Jordan Schnitzer and his Family Foundation. We'll have time after Daniel's talk for Q&A, so please do save your questions for the end. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. Gendered bathrooms are just down this hallway, down to the right and to the left. There are also water fountains down that way. There's a single stall gender-neutral bathroom on the first floor through the gift shop. Please do silence your cell phones if you haven't already, out of courtesy for our speaker and your fellow audience members. And now I'm going to share a little bit more about our speaker. Daniel Duford is an artist, writer, and teacher. He is a 2019 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, a 2010 Hallie Ford Fellow, and a recipient of a 2012 Art Matters grant. His murals and public art can be found throughout Portland. His books include John Brown's Body, The Unfortunates graphic novel, The Naked Boy, and The Green Man of Portland. His work has been shown in many places. An abbreviated list includes Mass MoCA, the Atlanta Center for Contemporary Art, Mary Hill Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Craft, which used to be in this building, PICA, and the Art Gym at Marylhurst University. Residencies have included MacDowell, Crow's Shadow Art Center, and the Ash Street Project. He is currently visiting professor of art at Reed College and the creative director at Building 5 here in Portland, Oregon. Thank you again for all being here tonight, and Daniel, we're super looking forward to your talk.
How does this sound? Does it sound right? So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to everyone at the Oregon Jewish Museum. This is just a really wonderful experience curating this. And thank you to the Jordan Schnitzer collection. Such a kind of honor and privilege to work with that collection, which is such a deep collection of many artists, but particularly of Richard Serra. So speaking of Richard Serra, I was wondering, does anybody know anything about him? Because I just found out about him yesterday, and so I don't know what to talk about. He's a baseball player, right? I do want to say a word on the curation of this. So as you heard in the introduction, I'm an artist and a writer, and so my approach to this was not as an art historian or a theorist. I was really approaching this as a maker, as a creator, and a practitioner, even though if you look at my work, in some ways it's the direct opposite of what Richard Serra does, but there's still so much to think about in his work. As it turns out, I do know a little bit about Richard Serra, so let's talk about it. So Richard Serra was born in 1938, and he died earlier this year. And he's best known for the monumental steel sculptures and his architectural interventions, and all of his obituaries rightly placed him as one of the most important contemporary sculptors of the last century, if not the most important sculptor. And that's all really well deserved, but he has also had a vigorous drawing practice, which could be considered as just a companion or a lesser version. But I think the more you look at it, you see that it's actually on par with the sculptural work that he did. So he was born in San Francisco, and his dad is from Spain. His mom was Ukrainian Jewish. His dad was a pipe fitter in the shipping industry down there. And so there's a story that he tells interestingly, if you know anything about Richard Serra, you do know that he was quite cantankerous, combative, and contrary. But one of the things he often talked about is he really resisted biographical readings of his work. However, there's one story he always tells about growing up, and that is that he was about 4 years old. He was with his dad, and he was on the shipyard. So he's watching one of these big Liberty ships, something like this. This is the William Clark being set off into the ocean. And he talked about the impact of seeing this massive, heavy steel ship, you know, girded by all this this kind of steel support, and then being pushed into the ocean and suddenly watching it buoyed and float. And so that those questions of scale, material, weight, and lack of weight were preoccupations throughout his entire career. And he also, when he was younger, he worked in the steel yards. He worked through high school. He worked his way at studying art history in California, and then he went to the Yale. He got an MFA at Yale. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. It's a school somewhere in the Coast. And there he was in a pretty dynamic group of artists. And one of them was his first wife, Nancy Graves. So they went to, they got grants to go to France, and he went there, and just to give you like a very brief, quick art historical context. So in the 50s, abstract expressionism was ascendant. So, and again, I'm assuming you probably know all this, but I'll just, it's worth kind of saying. So abstract expressionism was this explosion that's coming out of ideas of what the future of art would be, what contemporary art is supposed to be. And it moved all the energy after the war. You know, France was devastated. That was the art capital of the world. It moves to New York. It takes on this very kind of macho, action-based, heroic idea of completely getting rid of all narrative, all kind of figuration. What's interesting though is all these artists like Jackson Pollock, who you see here, you know, trained with the Mexican muralists. That when you look at actually where the real inspiration comes, it comes from Mexico. So Orozco and Siqueiros, those figures. But by the late 50s, when Serra is in school with this really dynamic group of artists, the abstract expressionism was starting to get a little like anything as it ascends and it reaches its apex. It's getting a little flabby. It's getting a little. It's not really speaking to this generation who has more of a sense of irony. One of the things about the abstract expressionists, they were relying on a lot of kind of Jungian ideas of the touch of the artist, and there's kind of mystical ideas. So when he's coming up, Richard Serra, he's a painter, he's absorbing lessons like this, but there's also this younger group of artists like Donald Judd, who are this minimalist, who are working with, you know, industrial fabrication, getting rid of, absolutely working against this, where there's just nothing but no touch of the artist, and you start to see that pushback against this generation. This is actually a later version of his earlier work. So what happens is Serra comes back. He apparently, when he was with Nancy Graves in France, he's just so frustrated by trying to be an abstract expressionist painter. He's not getting what he wants, and he destroys all his work. He throws it in the Seine. I don't know why he couldn't just, well, I haven't polluted the river, but I don't know. Anyway, but he starts to remember this training of his early years in the shipyard. And he's in the shipyards, he's in New York, and he's remembering this kind of imagery where it's, in this case, I think Pollock is really influential, not because of the imagery, but it's actually the action, it's the use of materials. So he started to use industrial, Richard Serra began to use these industrial materials. This is lead, it's molten lead. He starts to remember what it was like working in the shipyards. He's identifying with that space of the working class and really starting to reject what he would consider sort of, precious art materials. So this is a piece called Measurements of Time, Seeing is Believing, but he also did a series of these in warehouses that really got attention. And the thing about this, if you can imagine, is he's addressing the corner of the room. This is where he starts to develop what becomes a very disciplined approach to making art for his entire life. The thing about him, for all that he's known as being cantankerous, combative, he's also very disciplined. And it's rare actually to see an artist who's able to maintain these ideas while still developing. But the thing about this, if you can imagine, once that cools, you take that away, you destroy the artwork. So that becomes something in him where he approaches site specificity with the idea that if you remove the artwork, you destroy the artwork. So the way site specificity is often approached in contemporary art is usually goes something like, talk to everyone in the community that's around there, unearth all the histories that have been there, the ecological, political histories. Serra was never really interested in that site specificity. What he's interested in is like, what is the thing at this moment? How is the flow of, how do things flow through there? One other quick thing I will say too about this early point of his life, some of his cohorts are people like Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt, they're called the earth artists. So these are artists who are completely dismissing the studio as a space. They're going out to, Michael Heiser, people like that, they're going out to the West and they're doing these big interventions in the earth, which he really responded to, but he was always interested in urban, already kind of not destroyed, but already, they're already liminal spaces is where he kind of, how he thought about site specificity. So the other thing so Philip Glass was one of his friends who they hung out in France when he was there, the composer. Philip Glass was his studio assistant for a while. And so this is one of these early pieces where he starts to have revelations about material. These are rolls of lead. So again, like they're very blunt, they're kind of confrontational, but you can see there's something in them that requires you to feel with your body what this thing is. You feel the weight of these, but also there's this kind of, and it's, I don't want to say you deny the sensuality of it, but there's a kind of like, there's this malleability that's present in this work. So as we think of him now, in his early years up until about the 90s, he was considered a very difficult person to work with. He's kind of like someone nobody wanted to work with. He was often controversial in public spaces. We now consider works like this, where he's able to take this is Core-10 steel, so really thick rolled steel plates, and make them sinuous and really create this experience of the body through this. That was another thing I'll talk a little bit when we get into the drawings. There's a number of things he was really resistant to. So external metaphors being read into his work. He did everything he could to drain them of that. And he also, in cases like this is a beautiful photograph, but he really resisted picture making. So he didn't consider these things, there were experiences, sculptural experiences that you had with your body. And so, I mean, he died in 2024. He was certainly around for social media, but even then, he really did not, he would want to resist a photographer aestheticizing and creating a picture of the work, because in his mind that actually robs the work of what it's meant to do, which is to have you experience it in person. And then, he becomes, by the late 90s, early 2000s, he becomes the blue chip artist to go to. This is Bilbao, Spain, that Guggenheim, that's been designed by his friend Frank Gehry. And they often, there's another, you're going to hear me say, he didn't want, he's definitely someone who speaks from what he doesn't want. Most he does what he does. He did not like being compared to an architect. He was adamant that he was a sculptor. No offense against architects. I just saw your look in his face. But he respected Frank Gehry. He also didn't think Frank Gehry was an artist. He was an architect. So he had this idea that those are two very different things about making a space. Although clearly the scale he works in and the kind of interventions he does. But where you're seeing his reputation changing, where he becomes beloved in a way, in the sense that he is, people are seeing the value of this work. And I don't know if anyone's ever experienced these, I almost said seen, experienced them in person. They are quite profound. And he's just using the thing about these sculptures is there's no external attachments to prop these up. They're all engineered so they just hold each other up. And so it also creates a bit of menace. Like one of the things that people talk about, there's a kind of menace that is associated with walking through because it might fall on you. But he's really attuned to your perception of the space and allowing these things to, cantilever, and especially when you're aware that they are just propped up. So he has often courted controversy, and this is a piece I'm going to probably mispronounce this, but it's a German name, Bochum. Is that B-O-C-H-U-M? I think that's how you say it. It's a steel town in Germany, where in the 70s, he started to go to Germany. It's also where he met his second wife. He went there because there's a steel mill he really liked to work with. He had a really good relationship with them. And in this town, there was a fairly liberal city government, that commissioned him to do this piece called Terminal. So you can see how tall it is. That's actually a very small little bust. And that's only about 4 feet tall. Spinal tap joke. Sorry. But they're quite tall, and they're these 4 giant plates that lean against each other. So if you were to go inside, you can look up. Like much of his work, it's made for that space. He's thinking about the kind of flow of traffic or the flow of people through there. He's thinking about how, again, not what the picture of it looks like as an image, but what is your bodily experience of it? What is your experience of this thing? And he does this in these urban spaces. There's another piece I'm not showing. That was an earlier piece he did in the Bronx, kind of a dead-end street that was buried, where much of the plates are buried in the ground. They're kind of protruding a little bit, and there was a walkway above, and so photographers would be able to take pictures, do exactly what he didn't want, which was making it into a picture. So he would learn from those kind of things, and he really wanted to have a sense of, you might say blocking movement, or you could actually say that he's interested in making you aware of how you move through space. So what happened was there was a right-wing group called the Christian Democratic Party, or the CDU, and they started taking out ads, and they used this sculpture as the cause to try to get the other people out of office. And they said this is an affront to the steel workers. Steel this is like somebody who doesn't even know what he's doing, just prop these things up. And they were talking about how you need to make a heroic sculpture that shows how heroic the steel workers are. It didn't work. The steel workers who work with Serra knew that he knew what he was doing. I mean, and this is one of those things where that idea of like a kid can do that, you know, or she's just propping these things up. The subtlety and the craft that actually, and the engineering that it takes to actually pull this off is incredible. And you know, you can't quite see that. But anyway, this is what it looks like today in the same spot. So he would let the thing rust out and everything. But it's interesting so a lot of questions that come out of this time for both Serra and for public art in general. So we know, we hear this all the time still. We hear it in Portland, we hear it in every place. Why are we paying for this? Who wanted this? Like, there's this kind of tension about what public art is for. And so there's a really great essay by this writer, Douglas Crimp. He wrote in October, not in October, the month, October magazine. He talks about how there's a George Siegel sculpture that's honoring steel workers in Ohio, I think. And Douglas Crimp talks about how these they're figurative and they're shown as heroic and you work with the community. But Douglas Crimp points out that the so-called heroism is made to make them feel better about the fact that they are not unionized anymore, that they're kind of like the labor. It's really, it kind of hides what the labor issues are, whereas labor is also one of the things that's part of the meaning of looking at Serra. So the big controversy is really well known with this tilted arc. This was commissioned by the General Services Administration. It's at the Javits Government Center in New York. And it's a massive tilted wall, and it goes across this rounded pavilion. And at first it didn't cause controversy, but there was a couple of judges who worked in the building who didn't like the view, and they started to petition people in the building about how we got to get rid of this, and it's an affront to, you know, people can hide behind there and jump out at you. You can't do music on the mall, but nobody ever did that anyway. And so anyway, it became embroiled in this years-long legal battle. And so again, thinking back to that first that thrown lead piece, to remove the work is to destroy the work. And that's the argument that Serra made. And during the trial, or the hearings about this, you had luminaries from the art world, you had art critics, art historians. They would make arguments that had to do with things like about how artworks were controversial, then they become beloved over time. They talk about the aesthetics of this, and they try to use all these arguments. Interestingly, Serra was adamant. He's like, those aren't the right arguments. This work was made for this place, and it's about making it's not, and he was accused of being very anti-worker for this because he's blocking workers. Anyway, they lost the case, and it went up. And this is it being dismantled. And at that point, he became very vocal about art and censorship. Actually, I'm going to read a quote from this famous essay of his called Art and Censorship. He says, "In the United States, property rights are afforded protection and moral rights are not." And then this is the same time when Jesse Helms, the senator, was going after, and other Republican senators were going after the NEA. They're using this piece as well as Robert Mapplethorpe's homoerotic photos and the artist Andre Serrano to talk about why we need to get rid of the NEA. And so, I'll talk a little bit more about Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms does make an appearance downstairs. I don't know if you saw the show. We'll talk about that in a moment. But he became quite a staunch defender of against censorship of artists at this point. So, going back to this idea I mentioned at the beginning, he was very clear. He really resisted biographical readings of his work. His mother killed herself in the late 70s, and that had a huge impact on him. This is a piece called Drowned in the Sea. This is in Cologne, and this is specifically in homage to his mother, and it's the name of a Primo Levi book of essays of the same name that talk about the experience of living through the Holocaust. And so you could also see that in Gravity. This is at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So if you begin to think about this, the reason I'm showing is, and I'm going to get to the drawings in just a second, is to give you, this is what he's most well known for, but also to think about what he's up to. So like with Tilted Art, like with Terminal, there would be a reactionary response, which is always, and usually you get like graffiti, people will pee on it, they would do all kinds of stuff, and they'd say, this is really ugly, this is this eyesore that's getting in the way of our, it's against the civic flow of things. But I think his point is quite correct, and I think it's important to think about this, is that in the end, what most people are responding to is that property rights have more weight than moral rights, right? So in this piece, Gravity, it intersects the staircase, and you have to walk around it. So if you start to think of these pieces, because his abiding interest, even with the throwing the lead, was about how can I address the room and how we walk into the room. So you don't take the way you move through space for granted, right? That's a part of what he's thinking about. So this piece, again, I think in response to his mother, you have to actually encounter the weight of this thing, this bisection of it, and you have to actually encounter it with your body. So that brings us to drawing. So I was going to read this quote from him about drawing. He said, "I began making those drawings as a form of meditation, a form of concentration. I no longer wanted to make markings on a piece of paper. I wanted to make the drawing integral to its structure and properties. What I continually find to be true is that the concentration I apply to drawing is a way of tuning or honing the eye. The more I draw, the better I see, the more I understand." I think that's true of anyone who draws, but I think so the more I draw, the better I see, the more I understand. This is from his notebooks. He was known to always have a notebook making these forms in there. And they may certainly have been studies for sculptures, but again, I think it's important to remember a fundamental thing about the way Serra approached art making was that the thing was the thing, right? So drawing is a drawing, paper is paper, steel is steel, and that's it's not another thing. Of course, there are always cracks in that a little bit as an artist, but he would try to maintain that discipline. But in his drawing, this is him working on a large drawing with it. I'll show you in a second. He would use this paint stick, which is the stuff that's used here. This is the stuff right there. I actually found a picture of this. It's also used for marking livestock. So you could draw this. You could draw in wet livestock. But the one on the right is actually, there's a letter to Richard Serra. That's like a big block you would use. But you look at the scale of this working on this, and this is what I want to. This is the curatorial thing I'd like you to take away from this, or to take away from the show. If you were to encounter those works, it would be very easy to say, well, those are like squares and circles, and that's it. Like, did he just draw on the computer and they printed it out? Of course not. There's labor involved, and just like the steel, just like everything about him, the labor is part of the meaning, and the labor of the work that goes into, if you could imagine using those tools to make something this big and that dense, that labor translates to you as the viewer and how you experience it. So you can see he would have these blocks made, or you would use the, and I did a workshop here on Saturday, And I just assumed you could find paint sticks anywhere. And I had this experience where I went to hardware stores with it, and they were like, you ever have the experience with someone, like you go, like, I know there's pictures of the goddamn things. Like, I don't know if there's such a thing exists. And I just think, no, there really is paint. I couldn't find it. I had to like substitute, but they do exist. It's not Photoshop. Then this also, I just have this image, this is a conservator working on one of his large pieces. This also just gives you a sense of the scale of this. So scale is really, really important. So like the sculptures, the drawings exist in the room, they exist in space, and they exist in relationship to your body. This is an early one of this abstract slavery that he did. Here's another quote from him. Black is a property, not a quality. In terms of weight, black is heavier, creates a denser volume, holds itself in a more compressed field. A black shape can hold its space and place in relationship to a larger volume and alter the mass of that volume readily. So that's another important thing to think about when you go down there, is like black is not a color, it is a weight, it is a volume, it is a displacement of weight and volume. And so this, again, the other thing that you can see, this is slightly off kilter, not because he didn't own a level, but because he wanted that slight perceptual shift. So much of what he's dealing with is the perception that we have in our body. And so it forces you to consider, as a viewer, where you're standing in the space. So this just gives you a sense of some of the I'm sorry, this is some of the drawings that he did, where there is scale, balance, weight, and gravity. So he's not, again, it's important to realize he's not thinking about picture making, he's thinking about what the materials are. So in some way, this is on par with the steel, with the throne, the lead, the paper, and the canvas. He really thought a lot about that. You'll see versions downstairs of this series. There's one down there that's actually a print from this series. So speaking of printmaking, so that's the drawing. So the drawing is a companion practice to the sculpture, but he also really pushed things with the printmaking. He mainly worked with Gemini. I don't know if I'm supposed to say GEL or GEL, which is Gemini Editions Limited, which is down in LA. And they worked with a handful of artists. He worked with the same couple printers in the foreground. That's Javier Fumat, who was actually up here for the opening, which is really cool to meet him and actually get to ask him very specific technical questions about what was happening. But Serra pushed the boundaries of scale of printmaking. So again, if you think of someone who is concerned with labor, concerned with scale, concerned with what material has to say for itself, the printmaking is not just a means to recreate an image to make a cheaper copy. It is a thing in and of itself. And so it was interesting talking to Javier, where it was like, he would say, Richard Serra would call, and he said he'd talk really fast. He'd say, I want you to do this, blah, 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 and he'd say, and then he'd hang up. And then he'd be like, okay, how am I gonna do that? And so there are some really great things about how he pushed the boundary of all that. So you'd see like some of them are like a screen print that has an etching on top, and if you know anything about printmaking, and it was great to talk to them because I was trying to figure this out, how this works. So a screen print is you're basically taking an image on a screen and you're pressing ink through there onto a dry surface. But in etching, you are etching the image with acid. So the acid makes a depression in the plate, and then you rub the ink on there, and then you have to wet the plate, which wet the paper, which expands that. And so I'm like, how are they doing this? And clearly it was quite challenging. but this gives you a sense of the scale of the prints. And some of these things are, they would have to actually invent different techniques to figure out how to see Richard Serra's vision through. This is one of the pieces that are downstairs. I've been thinking a lot about black holes for the last couple of weeks. Looking at this work downstairs, this is a great example of how a reproduction doesn't do justice to the actual experience of the thing. But I've been thinking about this idea of blackness that he has, that he talks about. So it's weight, it's balance. So in this case, there's a few of these that are named after musicians. There's a Billie Holiday, there's this one. And thinking about this, is this a black hole or is this a blunt force object? And it's interesting how he's able to, just with this very simple thing, create the experience of either I'm going deep into a thing or I'm being like confronted with a thing. And that can happen at any time. And then this is the showstopper for me. This is Muddy Waters. This is downstairs. This is, I think, the biggest print down there. The other thing, if you haven't really noticed this, hopefully you've all seen the show, but if you haven't noticed this, there's no glass covering it. So it's very unusual for a print not to be behind glass for obvious reasons. It's very fragile. Serra, as you could imagine, didn't like to see the work behind glass. Obviously, if you're a collector and you spend a lot of money on it, you're going to want it behind glass. So it's such a treat to be able to see that so we can actually see the paper and you can see the texture that they got out of that. The paper, I find, this was so great to get this information from the printers. The paper is a very specific kind of paper made in Japan by a small group of women, Japanese women, and they can only make like 10 sheets a month. And they're the only ones who make it, and they make these huge sheets. So, Richard Serra would say, hey, I really need like an edition of 20 of these things, and they can only make a few. So just thinking about that attention to detail, where there's like the paper is made by these very specific people, and again, it's not like he's, and I think this is, I'm going to get to this towards the end, but I think to think about this idea of the paper is not just this neutral ground. It's not just this thing like, well, this is handy, I have this, or maybe if I can't get that, I'll get another one. It's very specific, and it has a scale, and it has a history, and then the shape, again, this kind of like off-kilter shape is really fantastic. So again, I think of, when you look at these, think of this in the paper and the ink in the same way you might think of the paint stick, the same way you might think of the quartz steel. And then there's I don't think it's this version from the series Paths and Edges. There's a couple of these downstairs. One or two, I can't remember now. The other thing is with Jordan Schnitzer has such a deep collection that at first I was picking everything. And then I realized that there's actually limits to the space. And so I then had to edit from there. That's what I call curating. Yeah, so again, this, like, if you think of this, it seems like it's just like going all the way back to the thrown molten lead into the picture of Jackson Pollock. This seems like a record of this movement, in which it is. There are pictures of him on the ground, and like he's this like compact, like man. He's always got a shirt. He's like, you can see him just like on the ground, like grinding this into these swirls and things like that. That's all apparent in here, that kind of movement. And it's such a blunt, greasy, dense tool, and that he's using to make this. And I really start to think about this as this kind of applied force. Like you look and there's like you can feel the applied force of this thing. So I'm close to being finished, and I'll take some questions. But I did want to talk about the political aspect of Richard Serra. So again, at this point he's lauded as one of this great artist, this great sculptor of the 20th century, 21st century. He's in the canon. So I feel like when someone gets put into the canon, we also get to forget about them. We say this is what they are, and then we don't have to think about them anymore. In fact, actually, this is just a quick digression. I've been reading a book about Monet, who I often also don't think about very much. There's a new biography of Monet that's out. You see the water lilies, of course, it blow you away. But I was like, nice pictures of French people on the Seine. But this biography is wonderful because it's actually reinvigorating who the artist actually was in his time, and they were tumultuous times. And now I'm suddenly thinking, oh, actually Monet is really, like there's some really incredible stuff happening in that work. So with Serra, I think he now is like, he's the guy who makes the big sculptures for the big museums. He's the guy who's apolitical. It doesn't have any, why would we even think about him? It just costs a lot of money to do these things. But he was, as I said, with the tilted arc, with the writing he would do, his advocacy, against people like Jesse Helms. So the piece on the right, these are both in the show. The piece on the right is called Buck Helms, and it was something he did as a fundraiser for I'm just forgetting his name, for Harvey Gantt, who was African American. He was running against Helms in that district. And then the other one was the only figurative thing you're going to see, which is an Abu Ghraib, and it was in protest against the George W. Bush administration. And he made a version of this that you can print out for free. So, but even as a figurative thing, it's reduced to this kind of like black force that's there. So, and then he did work, there's down there for Barack Obama, and there's a number of other things he did. I think what's interesting to consider him now, 2024, this moment, this place, is a lot of the contemporary artwork we've seen, particularly in the past 10 years, has become very polemical. It tells you exactly what you're supposed to feel about it. And there's a way that that also, so much is being made to take a picture of. I don't know, have you ever been in a museum? Like I remember a few years ago, I got to go to the Louvre, and there's just, you're like trying to look at like the Delacroix, and there's like people like doing this, and they're not even looking at the painting. And I don't want to sound like a prig or anything, but like, come on, I just want to like, come on. And so there's, so I think there's that sense of not seeing things, not being in your body. Richard Serra trusts us as viewers to not have a mediator, and to bring our bodies to the thing and have this experience. Just going to conclude here. This is Richard Serra pulling one of his big prints. It kind of gives you a feel for what it was like in the print shop. Again, how much labor there is. One of the things when I was start to work on this, thinking about why Richard Serra right now, and the more I worked on it, the more I was convinced that this work is really kind of necessary, sort of powerful right now, is this question of presence. There's so much about, even even if you go to, say, the Frieze Art Fair in LA, it's all like what's happening in contemporary arts, the biggest galleries. You go, and all the work, even if it's really great work, it feels like it's not feels, it is theirs simply for, it's like a market. You just go in there to kind of buy this work, and then people are taking pictures, and there's no experience of the work. And I feel like the more we're online, the more we are separated. I even look at younger artists framing things in a square so it fits onto Instagram. So the idea that you might come to something that doesn't necessarily, that doesn't tell you how you're supposed to think about it, that asks you actually to be present with the work, to notice things like a slightly cantilevered shape or a nubbiness of a kind of density. To look at that is really a powerful thing, to be present, to be together. There's a recent book by a writer named Ed Yong called An Immense World, and in it he talks about this idea of the Umwelt, which is a German term that refers to the experience of a body to its environment. So he starts the first chapter with this example of there's a human being in a dark room, and there's all kinds of other creatures. There's a mosquito, there's a bat, there's a dog, there's a bunch of other things. It sounds like a setup for a bad joke. And then they go to a bar. No, they don't go to a bar. It's a joke. It's not a joke. It talks about how the human is going to be disoriented because there's no light, because the way we perceive the world is based on our bodies, right? So like it's our sight, it's our hearing. We might, like the person might be listening. It's also how we touch, or bipedal. There's all those things that the body, even if we expand it with other kinds of things, that's the only way we can experience the world, right? The mosquito, on the other hand, is fine. The mosquito exactly knows how to find the blood of the person in the dark. The dog, the same thing. So the idea that the bodies of all these different beings, this wasn't Ed Yong's point, it was a much bigger point, but I think it's important to remember, because we often talk about ourselves and we often experience things in a somewhat disembodied way. So when I start to really look at this work and think about Richard Serra and then with like the me in the space, I realized that is the thing, that weight. So that's the title of the show is a quote of his. The weight that's being held by the dark, by the different shapes. That's a weight that you hold here in your body, whatever ability you have. So I think that's where I will leave this with Richard Serra, and I think again to re-encounter him in the way he would probably prefer, which is that you don't layer the biography onto it. You walk in there, and there's enough in there for you to have that experience. Thank you very much for coming, and let me know if you have any questions. Do you have any questions?
There's a drawing book that's downstairs for sale in the main bookstore, which I bought, and one of the first things in there has to do with his sketchbook, and comments on the fact that unlike many other artists, he did not sketch his sculptures in advance. He sketched them afterwards because the sketching made him see the sculptures in a way that brought them closer to him, that taught him something about what he had done. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, and I think that goes to his, again, right, he has this kind of discipline about his practice, and that is that drawing is not it's not just a preparatory thing, it's not a secondary thing, it is its own activity. And I loved that quote that I read that it does help him see better. Because he's really thinking through the materials. And I think that's what he does with whatever he's approaching. He's thinking through the process of the materials. But that drawing book is really beautiful.
A question.
Right.
Do you know why he named those pieces after the singers, Billie Holiday and Bo Diddley?
I don't. I was thinking about that actually, because he has these other titles, and I could be wrong about this, because I just don't know. My sense is that I feel like generationally there is this way of titling things with titles like that may or may not actually point back to a meaning of the thing, but they might have some kind of reference. So like I almost imagine he was listening to Muddy Waters, and then that's it. That like was the only. But I know I have thought about that, because I feel like there's Pete Volkus, who is a ceramic artist, also from the 50s, who I've curated to a show, would have titles that would be like Moby Dick or something like that, but it would be a big vase. So like I don't know if there is something specific about that he's calling attention to, or so I think I feel like there's something generationally there where that was just a way of titling it. I was talking to Javier, and he said, yeah, in the last works, because Richard Serra worked up right to his death this year. He said he would say the title of the thing is Casablanca, you know, and it'd be like a reference that for those important film to him, you know, and I don't know.
I was just thinking about the fact that all three of the people who, after whom he named these, were black.
Yeah.
As were the drawings themselves.
Yeah.
And I had no idea, but it just occurred to me as I was looking at it. Both of it, especially, is odd.
Yeah.
Person to pick as an icon.
Yeah, I thought about that because I don't know if you're all familiar with the artist Kerry James Marshall, who is a contemporary black artist. I think he's probably almost single-handedly responsible for the resurgence of black figurative painting in contemporary art. But he thought about, he would use black, and he would paint he still does. He paints the figures with black. He's like, okay, if you're going to say this is black, then I'm using black. And if you're going to talk about like the black figure, then I'm using black that's the color I'm going to go with. And how many blacks can I get out of it? Like, can I get blue black, brown black? And he really thinks about that. And you know, someone like Kerry James Marshall is of a generation who would have had teachers like him. So who would have stressed the importance of material, scale, all which you see in a painter like his. So it's also interesting to me how something like that, the color black, in his case, he said it's weight, it's not color, but that another artist, and this is why I think like when I started, I said I'm a very different artist than him. I work figuratively, narratively, but I do because I was trained by people who were trained by people like him to think, but paint is paint and it has a presence, and you know, to think about those things.
I'm curious if you found anything about him reflecting on the paint that he used in comparison to the steel. Like your talk really centered around his emphasis on the materials. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious if you found anything where he wrote anything about reflecting on the materials that he was using.
I'm trying to think. It's possible. I don't know if I came up with this myself just by reading it, but it's possible he did talk about that. Only because when I think of a work like this, I mean, he does talk about like why he doesn't want to. He'll use canvas because early on because it's a convenient strong substrate, but he doesn't want it to be a painting. He's adamant it's not a painting. But I look at this, and you're right, like, I see a direct corollary to his Core-10 steel plate, right? So I don't know, he very well could have, but I'm not sure if I made that connection myself. Any other questions?
I'm just thinking you made a reference that he was influenced by Carl Jung, is that right?
No, he wasn't. It was
the abstract expression.
right. So you read like a lot of the titles and a lot of the pieces by people like Pollock and Rothko. They're really into all these Jungian ideas of like the shadow self and the id, and that being expressed through this kind of abstract action painting. Whereas the next generation rejected it.
And there was physicality in that, but still those concepts, you know, the unconscious are all somewhat ephemeral. This is so bodily. So
Yes.
body. But you know, that's what Jung said too, live your animal.
Yes.
Live your own body, live your body, live your animal. So he had that too.
I think of him as like a, excuse me, as a realist in the true sense of the word. Like, you know, like you look at Courbet, was a realist painter because he painted what he observed and he painted the working class. But I think he's a true realist in the sense that there's no illusion. Like, it is real. If you think about too, this is also like, I'm not a psychologist, but I think you can say a lot about this. The generation that is Serra, they're almost like the Mad Magazine era. You know, so when Mad Magazine came out, I know, like, I'm looking around, and don't take offense, I realize you're all old enough to remember when Mad Magazine mattered a little bit. Where I feel like now it's just some sort of weird vestigial organ that's just out there and continues to live. But particularly in the 50s, I was not around then, but in the 50s when it first came out, it was like, you know, you read about people like Ken Kesey and all these, it was like Mad Magazine, this kind of wise ass, you know, sarcastic, ironic take on things was, I think, in response to the generation before that, because they were also World War II vets, so, you know, Serra was a little kid when that happened. So I feel like part of their response against the kind of Jungian idea was, even though he doesn't use humor, is to go, okay, I'm going to actually use the stuff that's absolutely anathema to what you might, like the other generation